In just 60 seconds, this analogy helped my CEO to understand the difficulty of merging apps. From there, I was able to get the approval for a 1-year feature freeze so we could focus on completing the app merger project. I want to walk you through each of these slides to show you how I incorporated the analogy. After that, I'm going to share the 3-step process I used to find the perfect analogy so you can easily explain complex topics in your own presentation and get that buy-in from your audience.
Okay, so how to use an analogy in your presentation? I started with this slide, the current situation. And I mentioned something like, we need to stop adding new features and dedicate full year to focus on app merger. Of course, if I had the time, I would add more slides here, but I just use this one slide. Then I continue with this slide to explain the analogy. The reason I say this is because app merger project is just like an organ transplant. It's extremely complex and high risk. So this is where the main argument comes in, which is the comparison between two things. And then from here, I will start going into the supportive arguments for the analogy to explain the analogy even further. So I'll mention an example here. We need to ensure the compatibility between donor and receiver, because you can't just take any organ and just put it into another person. So similarly, we need to make sure that the code from one app to another are compatible. We also need to make sure that UI are compatible. And if not, we'll need to rewrite and rebuild every single feature along the way. And this takes time. And I go on to explain these slides right here that relates to why we need to stop adding new features during app merger. I mentioned that just like in surgery, you'll need to stop consuming water and food before it happens. And you also need to make sure that the environment is sterile to avoid any risk of infection. So similarly in app merger, we need to make sure that we stop adding new features. It's just going to make things more complex and things are more likely to break or go wrong. In this slide right here, I mentioned more about the stability. So post-surgery, you need time to recover. Similarly in app merger, you need time to stabilize the code. After we're done with the project, we need to observe any problems that might occur. There might be optimizations we need to do. And I continue with this slide. Who's involved in this entire project? I added this slide here because I want to break and a special section just to explain the resource portion where it could be overlooked and it requires its own attention. So having a slight break can help with breaking the pattern and giving the audience a chance to realize that we're entering a new section here. Who's involved? You know how in surgeries, there's a surgical team? It consists of surgeons, nurses, and other specialists. They all have their role to play. They all need to help and coordinate with each other to ensure a successful operation. The same goes with app merger. So in the next slide here, I explain the app merger portion. So in app merger, we need a cross-team effort. We have to work with our vendor team, which is an external party, and they're not so familiar with our processes. So there'll be some challenges there. We also are building up our own app team. We're in the hiring phase right now. So there'll be new people coming in, and then there'll be the other app team that is already established, but we need their help in certain areas of the project. So there's some coordination needed there, and that takes time. So finally, once we reach the slide here, the suspense has been building up and reaching its peak. So the audience is eager to know what's next, how are we going to solve this problem, how are we going to move forward. So I mentioned things can go wrong, just like in any surgery. Complications can happen, and we might need more time than we think. So this slide sets up the next part of the presentation nicely, which is the solution.
By the way, if you want a copy of these slides and the annotations, you can get it for free by joining my newsletter. I share case studies from the legendary presenters like Steve Jobs and Elon Musk, as well as examples from my own experience that will help you become a more persuasive presenter. Link in the description below.
In order to find a perfect analogy for your presentation, you first need to understand the anatomy of an analogy. What is it made of? So the two main parts to an analogy is right here. You've got the main argument, which is the comparison between two things. And then you have the supportive arguments, everything down here. Finding the perfect analogy requires a lot of time and trial and error. But I have a 3-step process that makes it a little bit easier. First is to list down the points and then find the comparison, and then you translate all that into slides. Okay, let's start with the first step. before we can find a comparison between two things, we need to first declare the main argument. So in this case, I'm saying the merging of apps is very complex and high risk. So I want to find out how I can explain it better. Next, we identify the supporting arguments to back up that statement, that main argument. So we move down here. I've listed down all these different points that will help support my argument. With both the main argument and supporting arguments in place, we can move on to the next step, which is to find a comparison. To speed up the process, we could use ChatGPT and ask it to tell us what is a good comparison, right? But if you're like me, you want to turn this into a repeatable system that can just generate analogies again and again in the future. What we need is more than just a one question prompt for ChatGPT. What you need is to turn ChatGPT into your intern, or even better, turn it into an analogy generator. So thanks to the magic of editing, I already put the correct prompt into ChatGPT. I'm going to give ChatGPT the main argument and then the supporting arguments in the form of bullet points. And I'm going to give it a few rules to make sure it behaves the way I want it to. So first, it's going to generate an analogy to better explain the main argument, which is what we want, is finding a comparison. And not only that, it's going to justify it by mapping it back to each point that we have listed. Finally, there's suggested visuals for each of the points. So this is a bit of a bonus and not that important, but let's just run this and see the example. Remember, we did the exercise earlier where we have the main argument. So copy paste that. And then we're also going to give it some supportive arguments. So these bullet points right here, and just let it run. And just like that, ChatGPT is going to spit out some answers. The first analogy it's suggesting is building a superhighway junction. And then you can see the supporting arguments and how it's justifying that. So the first one is adding new features complicates on app merger. Imagine merging two separate roads into a superhighway, introducing new features like adding on ramps, but doing so haphazardly can cause traffic jams and slow down the overall flow. There's also a visual suggestion here. So illustrate the merging process with cars representing features and joining to a superhighway. So this is pretty good as a starting point, right? There's also other points that we have listed, and it's giving the comparison there. Rewriting code for compatibility is similar to upgrading road infrastructure. Redesigning UI for super app context is like a signage for direction, and so on and so forth. So this is already a good starting point for you. And bear in mind, ChatGPT is not the best at giving you the ultimate answer, but it is a good starting point. You take those and then you reiterate, modify until it makes sense for your presentation. Now, let's say you're not happy with this. You can always just say, try again. And it gives another analogy example. This time, the main argument is app merger is like orchestrating a symphony. Justifications are listed here. So you can go through them and decide which one you like. By the way, the third rule that I've put earlier suggests visuals for each of these points. It's just to help with brainstorming what are the right photos, visuals, icons maybe that you might want to include. So I figured that in one prompt, you can just get all this up front so that you can speed up your presentation slide creation process. But it's optional. You don't need to use that. Okay, now that you have your analogy in text form, you've taken it from ChatGPT and iterated until you're happy with that, it's time to translate it into slides. For my example, I'm using the app merger still, but I'm going to take one of ChatGPT's other recommendations for the analogy. So right here, I have a template, and I'm just going to replace this portion here with building a tower of cards. And then you move on to the next slide. You have the supportive argument, which is the thing that you are comparing to. And there's a visual placeholder here to remind me to replace it with an image. Right here, we're comparing it to a tower of cards. So adding new cards risks the tower collapsing. And then you can see here the visuals for that. We add some cards falling down. Now, on its own, this is already great. But then you can also add another slide, which is the thing that you're explaining. So you tie it back to the thing that you're explaining. In the context of app merger, what does that look like? So if we were to put this into action, you have one slide that explains the supportive argument, and then another slide that says, oh, in the context of app merger, when we add new features, it delays the project further. So this way, the audience can relate back that first argument you made about the analogy and then the thing itself.
By having ChatGPT become your analogy generator and applying the right slide structure, you can explain any complex topic in just 60 seconds. But this doesn't solve another problem. How do you keep the attention of your audience throughout the entire presentation? Watch this next so you learn how to use storytelling to make your presentation engaging and easy to follow.